Hello, tiny people. I'm so glad to be back with you this morning. Hope everything is well with you. Everybody's getting along nicely. And let's begin this morning. We're talking about politics and compromise before the Civil War. The election of 1848, two political parties were big in the nation back then. There was the Whig Party and the Democrats. The Democratic Party is still the one that's around today in its earlier form. The Whig Party was the big one. Now, President Polk, if you recall, had feared giving Zachary Taylor much say in the Mexican American War. He didn't want to make him a hero. But Zachary Taylor had won a battle at Buena Vista and had become a hero. And President Polk had been correct. Zachary Taylor did want to be president. So in 1848, the Whigs ran him at the top of the ticket. He was going for president, and he was a Louisiana slave owner. Now, the country was very much divided on slavery. This is the issue that was ripping the country apart. And they knew that if they just ran a pair of people for president and vice president, both of whom were pro slavery, that there was no way they'd win the presidency. So the Whig Party chose as Zachary Taylor's running mate a man named Millard Fillmore, who was a New York abolitionist. Now, sometimes you get the strangest people put together at the top of parties. I think it was pointed out just a little while ago, the Democrats this year had two people very much in contention for a while, who would be Bernie Sanders, who's an avowed socialist, who wants the government to own most things, and Michael Bloomberg, who's one of the richest men in America. So sometimes within a political party, you get varied groups of people. On the other side of the election of 1848, the Democrats ran a man named Lewis Cass. Now, Lewis Cass has not, for our intents and purposes, remained a very important or relevant figure, with one exception. He came up with the idea of popular sovereignty. Now, sovereignty is a word that means that person rules. A king is sovereign over his kingdom. Okay, the person rules, but this is not a person, this is popular sovereignty. It means the rule of the people who are living in an area in the Louisiana Territory. Remember, it had been said in the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise, that there'd be no more slavery there except for Missouri, north of 36 degrees 30 minutes. But Lewis Cass now came out and said, well, that was nearly 30 years ago. And those were a bunch of people back in Washington. Why should they decide how the people out in the Louisiana Territory vote whether or not they will have slavery? So this was a big idea. Still, Zachary Taylor won the election, but he didn't last very long. Zachary Taylor was elected in 1848. He was sworn in 1849 and died right at the start of 1850, having been ill for a little bit. He was replaced as president by a man named Millard Fillmore, that good looking fella over there on the right. Millard Fillmore becomes the 13th president. Back when I was a kid, there were signs all over Milwaukee for a period of about 2 months that said Millard Fillmore was the 13th president. And they were on buses, they were on signs over buildings, they were on notebooks, they were at just everywhere. And people all over were questioning, why does it say Millard Fillmore was the 13th president? And the answer was there was an advertising company trying to show how powerful it was that they could get a message out to the American people. And so they took a question that nobody knew. And with the exception of history students, nobody knew who the 13th president was. Nobody knew Millard Fillmore. Then they did that advertising campaign, and the percentage of people who could answer the question when they surveyed again randomly as to who was the 13th president had something like quintupled. There was like 5 times as many people could do it. Just, they proved that their advertising was powerful. This is something that came up. Okay, the country's being torn apart. How are we going to keep it together? This is the Compromise of 1850. Remember, a compromise, that word means that there are two or more groups that can't agree on something. They each want something very different. In this case, the end of slavery or the continuation of slavery? Well, in order not to actually go to war against each other, the House and the Senate, the Congress came up with the idea of this compromise. They said California would be a free state. And if you remember, in the Missouri Compromise, the Northerners ran around and got Maine to become a free state at the same time that Missouri was allowed in as a slave state. That way, they'd keep the balance in the Senate. But this time, control of Congress was given up by the South. This is huge. They're giving away something big. So California comes in as a free state. They get to have slaves in Washington, D.C., but there's no slave trade. Northerners had decided that this was a huge embarrassment to the country, that, oh my goodness, people, foreign dignitaries, ambassadors, they come over and on the streets of the capital city of the United States, there are human beings being bought and sold. This is too much for us. We need to get rid of the slave trade. However, slavery was allowed because the Southerners said, look, when I am elected to Congress, I will come up with my household. And if my household will consist of my wife, my children, my servants, that is my household. And for me, my servants happen to be my slaves. If you do not accept my household in Washington, then you do not accept me. If you do not accept me coming to live in the capital, then you don't accept the elected representative of my people. And therefore, there's no point in my state staying in the Union. So literally, they threatened secession, that is, breaking away from the country if they weren't allowed to bring their slaves into Washington, D.C. So California was in as a free state. The slave trade was prohibited. They couldn't buy and sell, but remember, D.C. is just a 10 square mile area. They were allowed to have their slaves in D.C. The yellow area there, the Utah Territory and the New Mexico Territory were formed. Now, those are areas, our territories are areas that have been designated as the stage right before statehood. So these guys are just getting ready to become states. Once they fix the borders and get in their Republican form of government, they can apply for statehood. And this is where the Southerners got something back. Utah and New Mexico would have been allowed to have slaves. Finally, the big one. It says the FSA passed. The FSA is the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act. Oh, I forgot to mention that Salik, when he's a little bit older, this is the style for him. I think it's going to work. You know, he's got plenty of hair on the sides there. If he can just get that little curl thing going. And I think maybe the bow tie. He could rock the bow tie. This would be good. Okay. Now, the North and the South, they already are having bad feelings between each other because of their opinion on slavery. Now they begin to distrust each other, and that's a bad situation. Dislike and distrust, that's really edging towards war. If you see the poster on the left there, Fugitive Slaves Attention, what that is people up in the North posted posters, tried to work the Underground Railroad even harder than it had before. What they did was they refused to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. Well, that's what the South most wanted out of the Compromise of 1850. Yes, they gave up control of Congress, but if the fugitive slaves, all the slaves in the North, were returned to them, then the Southerners would literally get hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property returned to them. And again, remember, from a Southern point of view, those black slaves were property. It would be like a rancher having his cattle returned to him. It would be a very valuable thing. But the Northerners said, no, We simply refuse to do that. The man's been living down the road from me for 5 years now. He seems to be a reasonable person. I, they weren't treating him as equals in most places. It was still a racial difference. But still, I'm not going to put that man in chains. I don't hate him. I don't believe in slavery. And as a result, none of the slaves, or very few of the slaves, were returned. That infuriated the South. They said, hey, Northerners, you lied to us because we gave you control of Congress and you promised to give us all these valuable slaves, but you did not. That's terrible. So the Southerners were ticked off. Then came the publishing of a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin, although you can't see the name on there, was written by a lady named Harriet Beecher Stowe, capital Harriet, space, capital Beecher, Beecher, space, capital Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe was the niece of a man named Henry Ward Beecher, who was one of the two or three leading abolitionists in the country. And Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a book about a slave named Uncle Tom. Uncle Tom was a guy who understood his condition of slavery and just tried to make the best of it. Uncle Tom, to his core, was just a decent human being. When a person reads Uncle Tom's Cabin, they like Uncle Tom. He's just a good person. But through no fault of his own, Uncle Tom was sold down the river. His master couldn't afford him anymore. He sold him down the river. Down the river, we're talking about the Mississippi. What that means is to be sold down the river is to be sold deeper into the South. And when a slave was brought deeper into the South, first of all, they were clearly further away from a place where they might make their escape. But more importantly, the working conditions, the weather, the environment became much, much more harsh. Many, many more slaves died in the deep South than they did up towards the North. So Uncle Tom's life turns very bad. The girl on the picture of the cover is a girl named Eliza. She's one of the characters. She's a slave who has just had a baby. And she decides, you know, I, I've got to get away. I do not want my baby raised as a slave. I don't want my baby to be a piece of property. The best part about this portion of Uncle Tom's Cabin is that this story is based on a true story. It was aggrandized and fictionalized with dialogue and such, but this actually happened. So Eliza, holding her baby, started to make her way north. And slaves were taught a few songs that gave directions as to how to get north. They were taught a few signs and places along the way where they could get help from the Underground Railroad. Well, one of these was on the north side of the Ohio River, and it was a lighthouse. And Eliza knew that if she could get these few miles left up to this lighthouse, if she could get across the Ohio River, then members of the Underground Railroad, abolitionists, would hide her away and whisk her north to where she could continue to be free and her baby could be raised never to be a slave. So Eliza makes it nearly to the shore of the Ohio River, but it is late, late fall working into winter, and the river is freezing over. It's not completely frozen. It's not solid. It's nothing that someone would willingly walk on, but there are large chunks of ice. And when Eliza approaches, she has been spotted by slave catchers, men whose job it is to capture and re-imprison slaves, bring them back to their masters in the South. Well, Eliza, with these slave catchers literally starting to run after her, makes it to the shore and makes an instant decision that it would be better to die trying to get away and to die free than it would be to remain a slave. And so Eliza jumps up onto the first piece of ice and kicks herself over to the second and the third and the fourth. And she literally runs across the Ohio River by kicking herself from ice piece to ice piece. And she makes it nearly all the way across. And at the very, very end, she slips, starts to fall, and throws her hand up, and it is grabbed by another hand on the other side. And it is an abolitionist who pulls her and the baby up and gets them over into the Underground Railroad and to safety. Now, the slave catchers who had been chasing her, they're out after money, not freedom. Their motivation is not the same. And as a result, when we got to the river and she started to run across, they stopped and simply watched her go. This is a fellow with a Tony Home permanent. No, this is a person who became the 14th president of the United States, Franklin Pierce. Democrats were in a bad way. They needed somebody that could run effectively for president. Now, most of the big name Democrats, they would have alienated one group or another. They couldn't take, for example, a John C. Calhoun because his famous quote was, "Slavery is a positive good for everyone, including the slave." Well, certainly nobody in the North would vote for a man like that. And there were other Democrats from around the country who would alienate the Southerners. So there was nobody solid. So they looked around, and finally somebody at the convention said, "Well, how about Franklin Pierce?" And to be honest, most people in the convention said, "Who? Perfect. He's the guy for us." And on the 49th ballot, they elected Franklin Pierce as their candidate for the presidency. He went on to win. He became the 14th president, but his wife had been pregnant as they ran for office, and the baby was born, and the baby died soon after their trip to the White House. He was devastated. He was apparently a very loving man, and he adored his wife, and she was heartbroken, and they never recovered from the loss of his son. It looked as if he might have been a pretty good president and a pretty good man, but the death of the baby put his mind elsewhere. Incidentally, things like this still happen. When George H.W. Bush, that's George Bush the first, was president, in his first term, he won the first Gulf War against Saddam Hussein of Iraq. He was extremely popular. People thought, oh my gosh, there's no way to beat this guy. He is a shoo-in for a second term. And all of the big name Democrats said, we're not going to run because if we run against George Bush, we'll lose. And so they went and they looked for the second string Democrats. And none of them were willing to run because they thought, why would I want to do all that work and lose the presidency? So they went down to the third string of Democrats. They ended up, get this, they ended up drafting the governor of Arkansas. I mean, as one of the other candidates said, the guy is making $30,000 a year. You know, so's the guy that runs the corner drugstore. This is ridiculous. This guy's a nobody. They underestimated him slightly because that person's name was William Jefferson Clinton, and he turned out to be a masterful politician. He defeated George H.W. Bush, so Bush only became a one-term president, and then he went on and won himself a second term as president. Bill Clinton did. Arguments reached the level of the physical even on the floor of the Senate. There were two senators, Charles Sumner and Andrew Butler of South Carolina, and they were constantly debating with each other. Now, the way the Senate's debates worked back then was one senator would make a speech, and Charles Sumner was an abolitionist. He would make a speech saying that slavery was deplorable. And Andrew Butler, a senator from South Carolina, would make a speech saying, no, slavery's great, a couple of weeks later. And he would give his arguments. But they took some time between, but this had been going on for a while. Well, there was one time when Andrew Butler, the senator from South Carolina, was not in the Senate. He had some other business somewhere. And Charles Sumner gave a speech. Now, if I am having an argument with one of you guys, I am having an argument with Mira. And Mira says, I think children should not have any homework because homework stops us from playing. And I say, well, that's a great point. And play is important, but it's really important that kids spend as much of their youthful time improving themselves and getting ready for the challenges of adulthood. You'll get a far better education by doing homework. And then goes back and Mira says, I'm not sure the advice of a fat, bald man is what I need here. I'm a child. Now, she's just changed the rules of the game. She stopped debating the point that we were debating, and she made it a personal attack on me. Well, that's what Senator Sumner did while Andrew Butler was not present. He went a little too far and he made some personal attacks on Andrew Butler. Now, this was seen as a dishonorable thing to the Southerners. And as a result, Andrew Butler's nephew, his name was Preston Brooks. Preston Brooks was a member of the House of Representatives. And remember, in the Capitol building, the Senate is on one side of the building, the House of Representatives is on the other. So he's only on the other end of the building. And he hears about this attack that has been made verbally on his uncle, because Andrew Butler was Preston Brooks' uncle. So the next day, he gets himself a hardwood cane. And nobody took any notice of this because it was the fashion of the day to carry a cane for a gentleman. And Andrew Butler simply walks down into the Senate. I mean, he's a congressman. It makes sense to allow him in. And he walks into the Senate and he simply walks up to Charles Sumner and starts beating him with a cane. And he beat him so hard and so badly that it took more than a year for Senator Sumner to be able to return to the Senate. Now, this is big in two reasons. First of all, just the fact that it became physical on the floor of the Senate, that's not good. Secondly, it meant that the people of Massachusetts, which was Charles Sumner's home state, would only have one of their two legally recognized senators for over a year. The representation of the people was seriously curtailed, at least for Massachusetts. Well, Preston Brooks, after he had attacked Charles Sumner, immediately walked back over to the House of Representatives. He had prepared a letter resigning from the House. He gave it to the Speaker of the House, got on his horse, and rode back to South Carolina. They had to have an election to replace him. And the people of his district immediately elected Preston Brooks as a congressman again and sent him right back to Washington. And from all over the South, Preston Brooks received gifts of hardwood canes with notes saying something akin to, please use this on the next abolitionist that speaks up, or next time, why don't you kill him? In our next episode, Mr. Holman will explain John Brown. Thank you, tiny people. Have a lovely day.